Silence is dangerous when it belongs to someone who has nothing left to prove. The words were spoken lightly, followed by polite laughter that echoed beneath the high ceilings of Blackthorn Manor, where candlelight flickered against cold stone walls and painted every smile a little too sharp. Clara Whitfield stood near the edge of the grand hall, hands folded neatly before her, her gaze lowered just enough to be mistaken for submission, her presence acknowledged by no one and dismissed by everyone. She had arrived only days ago, a quiet companion brought in out of obligation rather than interest, and already she had become part of the background, like the polished floors or the tall windows veiled in winter frost. She doesn't speak, a lady murmured nearby, her voice dipped in amusement. I suspect she has nothing worth saying. And again, laughter followed, soft and effortless, the kind that did not expect resistance. Clara did not respond, not with words, not with expression. Only a slight tightening of her fingers where they rested against the fabric of her worn gloves, a movement so small it passed unnoticed by all but one. From across the room, Duke Adrian Blackthorn watched, his dark gaze lingering not on the laughter, but on the stillness that followed it. On the way, Clara did not shrink, did not retreat, did not plead for acknowledgement. There was something in that silence that did not resemble weakness, something too controlled, too deliberate. Later that evening, as the guests drifted into smaller conversations and the fire burned low, Clara moved quietly through the corridors, her footsteps soft against the stone, carrying a stack of ledgers no one had asked her to touch. The household accounts had been in disarray for weeks, a problem that had frustrated even the Duke's most trusted advisors. Yet she had taken them without permission, without announcement, as though the task itself had called to her. Hours passed unnoticed, the manor falling into a hush broken only by the distant ticking of a clock and the faint whisper of turning pages. It was near midnight when Adrian found her, seated alone at a small desk beneath a single candle, her face half-shadowed, her posture calm, her pen moving with quiet certainty across columns of figures that had baffled men twice her age. He did not speak at first, only watched as she corrected errors, rebalanced totals, and restored order with a precision that bordered on instinct. When she finally sensed his presence, Clara paused, lifting her eyes just enough to meet his gaze, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need voice to be understood. She said nothing, not a word. Yet in that silence, Adrian realized he had been wrong to listen to the room, wrong to believe what others saw so easily, because there, in the quiet glow of a single candle, the woman they had dismissed as empty revealed a depth none of them had earned the right to hear, and for the first time, the Duke began to wonder if her silence had never been absence at all, but restraint. The next morning arrived with a quiet chill that settled into the stone walls of Blackthorn Manor, the kind of cold that lingered even after the fires were lit, and yet the memory of candlelight and silent precision from the night before had not left Adrian Blackthorn's mind. He stood at the far end of the long dining table, listening as his advisors once again debated numbers that no longer troubled him, their voices layered with frustration, unaware that the solution had already been written in careful ink by a woman they had chosen not to see. Clara entered the room without announcement, as she always did, her steps measured, her presence soft enough to be ignored, and yet steady enough to endure every glance that passed over her without pause. She carried nothing this time, no ledgers, no papers, only that same composed stillness that seemed to unsettle him more than any spoken argument. We are still short by several thousand, one man insisted, tapping his fingers against the table. The figures refused to reconcile, and Adrian's gaze shifted, not to the speaker, but to Clara, who had taken her place near the window, the pale morning light catching the edge of her profile. She did not interrupt, did not offer correction, even though he now knew she could. Instead, she simply listened, her silence stretching between each miscalculation like an unspoken truth. Something tightened in his chest, not irritation, not quite curiosity, but something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Miss Whitfield, he said at last, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, and for the first time, every eye turned to her, not in respect, but in mild confusion. She lifted her gaze, calm, attentive, waiting. You reviewed the accounts last evening. He continued, ignoring the subtle shift in posture among his advisors. Tell me, are we short? A pause followed, not because she did not know the answer, but because the room itself seemed unprepared to hear her speak. Clara stepped forward, just one measured step, her hands still folded before her, her voice quiet but clear, carrying farther than anyone expected. No, Your Grace, she said, and the simplicity of her answer settled like a stone in still water, rippling outward into disbelief. One of the men let out a short, incredulous breath. That is impossible, he muttered, but Adrian did not look at him, his attention fixed entirely on Clara. Explain, he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. She inclined her head slightly, then moved to the table, her fingers resting lightly on the parchment as she indicated a column that had been overlooked, a misplacement of figures so subtle it had hidden itself in plain sight. She did not rush, did not embellish, only spoke when necessary, each word deliberate, each explanation precise, until the room fell into a silence far deeper than the one they had mocked the night before. When she finished, she stepped back without expectation, as though her role had never been to impress, only to correct. No one laughed this time, no one whispered, and for a moment, the absence of their voices felt heavier than their judgment ever had. Adrian studied her, the quiet return of her composure, the way she withdrew without seeking acknowledgement, and something within him shifted, something that no longer allowed him to accept what others had decided about her, because now he had seen it, not just the intelligence, not just the restraint, but the choice behind it, the decision to remain silent in a world that had never learned how to listen, and he began to understand that whatever strength Clara Whitfield carried, it was not something given freely, but something earned in ways no one in that room had yet deserved to know. The change did not announce itself. It settled quietly into the rhythm of the manor, as subtle as the shifting of light across the long corridors, and yet impossible for Adrian Blackthorne to ignore. By afternoon, the corrected accounts had already begun to ripple through his estate, decisions made with a clarity that had been absent for weeks, and still, what lingered in his thoughts was not the numbers, but the woman who had rewritten them without asking to be seen. Clara Whitfield moved through the halls as she always had, her presence steady, her expression composed, as though nothing of importance had occurred, as though she had not just dismantled the certainty of men who had dismissed her hours before, but the manor had changed in its own quiet way. Conversations softened when she passed, glances lingered a second longer than before, not yet respect, but no longer indifference. Still, not all voices learned so quickly. Near the western sitting room, where the afternoon sun filtered through tall windows and cast pale gold across the floor, a familiar tone of amusement broke the fragile shift in atmosphere. A fortunate guess, one lady remarked, her smile thin, her words light enough to avoid open offense. Even the quiet ones stumble upon usefulness from time to time, and though a few nearby offered polite laughter, it lacked the ease it had carried before. Clara stood within earshot, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze lowered, and once again, she did not respond. No protest, no defense, only silence that seemed to deepen rather than retreat. Adrian paused at the far end of the corridor, unseen for a moment, listening, watching, and something within him sharpened. It would have been easy to let it pass, easier still to ignore it as he had done with countless trivial remarks within his own household. But now he understood that what they called quiet was not absence, and what they dismissed so casually carried a weight they had never considered. He stepped forward, his presence cutting cleanly through the conversation, and the shift was immediate, voices falling, posture straightening, the room aligning itself instinctively around him. It was not a guess, he said, his tone measured, controlled, yet carrying an edge that left no space for dismissal, and the lady's smile faltered. Just slightly, just enough. Adrian's gaze did not linger on her. It moved instead to Clara, who had finally lifted her eyes, meeting his with the same calm steadiness he had begun to recognize. Miss Whitfield identified an error none of you could see. He continued, not raising his voice, not needing to. Perhaps it would be wise to reconsider what you assume about silence. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and no one dared to challenge them. Clara inclined her head, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement, as though the moment belonged not to her defense, but to something already understood. And yet, even as the others withdrew into careful politeness, Adrian realized this was not the victory they might imagine. She had not spoken for herself, had not claimed the recognition that had been forced upon the room, and as she turned to leave, her steps as measured as ever, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that unsettled the certainty he had carried for years, because strength that demanded. Attention was easy to recognize, easy to respond to, but this quiet, deliberate restraint, this refusal to reach for validation, revealed a depth he could not yet fully understand, only sense. And for the first time in a long while, Adrian Blackthorne found himself not commanding a situation, but following a question, one that lingered long after Clara Whitfield had disappeared down the corridor, leaving behind a silence that no one in that house would mistake so easily again. That evening, the manor seemed quieter than usual, as though the walls themselves had begun to listen, and Adrian Blackthorne found no rest in the stillness. The fire in his study burned low, casting long shadows across shelves of untouched books, yet his attention remained fixed not on his work, but on a single question that refused to leave him. Why would someone capable of such clarity choose to remain unseen? He had encountered ambition in many forms, had watched men speak loudly to secure recognition they barely deserved, and yet Clara Whitfield had done the opposite, stepping back the moment her purpose was fulfilled, as though visibility itself held no value to her. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Beyond the heavy doors, the manor moved through its evening routine, servants passing quietly, candles being lit one by one, corridors dimming into a soft golden glow, and somewhere within that vast space, she remained as she always did, present but unnoticed. It was not long before he found himself leaving his study without clear intention, his steps guided less by reason and more by that quiet pull he had not yet learned to ignore. The eastern wing stood in near silence, its windows reflecting the deepening night, and it was there, near a small reading room rarely used by guests, that he saw her again. Clara sat by the window, a single candle at her side, a book resting open in her hands. Though her eyes were not moving across the page, she seemed distant, as though her thoughts had carried her somewhere far beyond the manor walls. And for a moment, Adrian did not speak, choosing instead to observe, to understand what could not be forced into words. Then, softly, he stepped forward, the faint sound of his presence drawing her attention. She looked up, calm as always, though something flickered briefly in her expression, something he had not seen before, not fear, not surprise, but a quiet awareness of being seen. "You avoid acknowledgement," he said, his voice measured, not accusatory, but searching. Clara closed the book gently, her fingers lingering on its edge before she answered. "I do not seek what is given too easily, Your Grace." Her tone was steady, neither defensive nor distant, simply honest. Adrian studied her more closely now, the way she held herself, the careful balance between restraint and strength, and he realized that her silence was not a shield, but a choice, deliberate and unwavering. "Most would have corrected them immediately," he continued. "Most would have ensured they were heard." Clara's gaze did not waver. "And most would have needed to be heard," she replied. And in that moment, something shifted again, something deeper, as though each quiet answer revealed not just her mind, but the principles that guided it. The room seemed smaller somehow. The distance between them narrowed not by proximity, but by understanding. And Adrian felt the rare sensation of encountering something he could not command, only respect. Yet even as the conversation settled into silence once more, he sensed there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken, something that explained the origin of such restraint. Clara rose then, not abruptly, but with the same quiet composure she carried in all things. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, inclining her head before moving past him, her steps soft against the floor, her presence fading once again into the vastness of the manor. Adrian remained where he stood, the echo of her words lingering, and for the first time, he understood that whatever strength she possessed had not been shaped in comfort, but in something far more demanding, something that had taught her not just when to speak, but when silence held greater power. And as the candlelight flickered against the window, he realized he was no longer simply observing Clara Whitfield. He was beginning to seek the truth she had never offered freely. The days that followed did not return to what they had been, though no one in Blackthorn Manor spoke of the shift directly. And yet Adrian could feel it in the subtle hesitation of voices, in the careful way certain remarks were no longer made within Clara Whitfield's hearing, as though the household itself had begun to reconsider the boundaries it once enforced without question. Still, not all change came easily, and not all minds yielded to quiet proof. By late afternoon, a small gathering had formed in the drawing room, invited guests from neighboring estates, their presence filling the space with polished conversation and measured curiosity, and as always, Clara remained at the edge of it, positioned where she could assist if needed, yet never expected to belong. Adrian observed from a distance, his posture composed, though his attention moved with deliberate focus, tracking the subtle movements others would overlook, the way Clara anticipated needs before they were spoken, the way she corrected small oversights without drawing attention, her presence threading quietly through the room like something essential yet unclaimed. "You keep unusual company, Your Grace," a visiting gentleman remarked, his tone light, but edged with implication, his gaze drifting toward Clara with a faint, dismissive smile. I had not realized silence was now considered a qualification. A few soft chuckles followed, restrained, cautious, as though the room itself waited to see how far such words might be allowed to travel. Adrian did not respond immediately, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching just long enough to unsettle the man who had spoken. Clara, meanwhile, did not react at all, not outwardly, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, as though the remark had never reached her. But Adrian had learned enough to know that her stillness was never absence, and something within him resisted the ease with which others continued to define her. Before he could speak, however, the conversation shifted, a more pressing matter drawing attention. A dispute over a recent land agreement, details tangled, voices rising just enough to reveal the underlying tension. Numbers were quoted, terms debated, yet uncertainty lingered, no clear resolution emerging. Adrian listened, recognizing the familiar pattern of confusion masked by confidence, and almost instinctively, his gaze moved toward Clara. She stood near the window once more, her attention fixed not on the speakers, but on the documents laid carelessly across a nearby table, her eyes scanning, assessing, absorbing. It was a small moment, easily missed, but to Adrian, it carried weight. He stepped forward then, interrupting the flow of discussion with quiet authority. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and the room stilled, attention shifting once again, though this time with something closer to anticipation than doubt. Clara turned, meeting his gaze, and for a brief second, something unreadable passed between them, something that acknowledged both the expectation and the risk it carried. "Would you review the terms?" he continued, his tone steady, offering no explanation beyond the request itself. A pause followed, the kind that revealed more about the room than any words could. Hesitation layered with disbelief, curiosity, and a faint trace of resistance. Clara moved forward without protest, her steps measured, her expression unchanged as she reached for the documents, her fingers brushing lightly against the parchment before she began to read. Silence settled once more, but this time it was different, not dismissive, not indifferent, but waiting, and as the seconds passed, Adrian realized that this moment would not simply confirm what he already knew. It would challenge what everyone else still refused to see. And as Clara Whitfield lifted her gaze from the page, preparing to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath, unaware that it stood on the edge of understanding something it had never truly valued until now. Clara Whitfield did not rush to speak, and that alone unsettled the room more than any immediate answer could have done, because silence, when expected to break quickly, becomes a mirror that forces others to confront their own impatience. She read every line with care, her fingers steady against the parchment, her expression unchanged, while the gathered voices held themselves in cautious restraint, as though unsure whether to interrupt or to wait. Adrian Blackthorn watched closely, not the document, but her, the slight narrowing of her gaze, the subtle shift of her posture, the quiet certainty building behind a calm exterior that revealed nothing to those who did not know how to look. Finally, she placed the paper back upon the table, her hand withdrawing with measured grace. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, yet it carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. "The agreement is not flawed," she said, and a faint stir passed through the guests, the kind that precedes contradiction, but she continued. "Before it could form, it has been misread. A single sentence, precise and composed, yet it shifted the entire weight of the discussion." One of the gentlemen stepped forward, a hint of challenge returning to his expression. "And you are certain of this?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the quiet disbelief that still lingered beneath his tone. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she replied, then turned slightly, indicating a specific clause buried within the text, her explanation unfolding with quiet logic, each detail placed with care, each correction revealing not only the error, but the assumptions that had allowed it to persist. There was no embellishment, no attempt to impress, only clarity, and as her words settled, the resistance in the room began to dissolve, replaced by something more reluctant, something closer to recognition. Adrian remained still, his attention fixed on her as the realization spread across the faces around them, the slow understanding that the woman they had dismissed possessed a command of detail none of them had matched. When she finished, she stepped back once more, returning to stillness as though nothing had changed, as though she had not just redirected the course of a conversation that had stalled for hours. This time, no one spoke immediately, and the silence that followed was no longer dismissive. It was contemplative, heavy with the awareness of something overlooked for far too long. The gentleman who had questioned her earlier inclined his head slightly, a gesture small, yet significant. "It appears we have been mistaken," he admitted, the words careful, measured, carrying with them the weight of quiet concession. Clara did not respond to the acknowledgement, did not claim it, only lowered her gaze once more, her composure unbroken, her presence returning to that same quiet space she had occupied from the beginning. Yet Adrian understood that nothing had truly returned to what it had been, because now the room had seen it, not fully, not completely, but enough to shift the balance, enough to plant doubt in their assumptions. And as the conversation resumed, more measured now, more deliberate, he realized that the strength Clara Whitfield carried did not need to be proven through force or volume. It revealed itself precisely when it was needed, and then withdrew, leaving behind something far more lasting than noise, something that could not be easily dismissed again. And in that quiet aftermath, Adrian felt the certainty settle within him that this was no coincidence, no momentary display, but a pattern, a truth that had existed long before she stepped into his manor, and one that he was only beginning to understand. Even after the discussion moved on, the air in the drawing room did not fully recover its former ease, as though something invisible had shifted its place among them, something that could not be dismissed as easily as before. Conversations resumed, but more cautiously now, voices measured, laughter restrained, and though Clara Whitfield had stepped back into her quiet position near the window, she was no longer entirely unseen. Adrian Blackthorne remained where he stood for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following the subtle ways the room adjusted around her presence, the careful glances, the reconsidered tones, the absence of careless remarks that had once flowed without thought. Yet even as recognition began to form, it carried with it a new kind of tension, one that did not seek to understand her, but to test her. "It is remarkable," a woman's voice spoke softly, though not softly enough to escape notice, her smile composed, her posture elegant. "How quickly a single moment can change perceptions." She turned slightly, her gaze settling on Clara with deliberate precision. "Though I do wonder if such moments can truly define someone, or if they are merely fortunate circumstances." The words were polished, refined, yet beneath them lay a quiet challenge, one that sought not to dismiss directly, but to cast doubt in a more subtle form. Clara did not react, not outwardly, her hands remaining still, her gaze lowered once more, and for a brief second, it seemed as though the moment might pass unclaimed. But Adrian had begun to recognize the pattern, The way silence invited assumption, the way others filled its space with their own conclusions. He watched closely, not stepping forward this time, not intervening, because something told him this moment did not belong to him. The room waited, though few realized they were doing so, their attention drawn not by expectation, but by the quiet tension that had begun to gather. Clara lifted her eyes then, not abruptly, but with a calm steadiness that carried no trace of hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice remained as measured as ever, yet there was something different within it, something that did not seek to defend, but simply to state what was true. "Circumstances reveal what is already present," she said, her words soft, yet unmistakably clear. "They do not create it." The simplicity of the statement settled into the room, not as confrontation, but as quiet certainty, and for a moment, no one responded, because there was nothing to oppose, nothing exaggerated, nothing that could be easily dismissed. The woman's smile held, but only just, its edges, tightening in a way that betrayed the shift beneath its surface. Adrian felt it then, the unmistakable change, not in Clara, who remained as composed as ever, but in the room itself, in the way her voice had altered the balance without raising itself above a calm tone, without seeking approval or acknowledgement. She had not raised her voice, had not defended her worth, and yet she had claimed something far more significant, the right to define herself without permission. And as the conversation resumed once more, quieter now, more careful, Adrian understood that this was not the culmination of something, but the beginning, because the more they began to see her, the more they would question what they had missed before, and somewhere beneath that realization, something deeper waited, something that had shaped her silence long before she stepped into his world, something that had not yet been revealed, but would not remain hidden forever. That night, long after the guests had retired and the manor fell into its familiar hush, Adrian Blackthorne found himself once again walking corridors he had crossed 1,000 times before, though never with this same quiet unrest settling beneath his composure. The candles burned low, their flickering light stretching shadows along the stone walls, and somewhere within that vast silence, his thoughts returned, not to the conversations of the evening, but to a single moment, a single voice that had not risen, yet had changed the shape of everything around it. Clara Whitfield had not defended herself, had not argued, had not sought to prove anything, and yet she had left no space for doubt. It was not defiance that unsettled him, but certainty, the kind that required no audience. He found her again without intention, as though the manor itself had learned to guide him toward her presence, standing near the tall window at the end of the eastern corridor, the night sky stretching beyond the glass in a deep, endless black, scattered faintly with distant stars. She did not turn when he approached, though he knew she had heard him, her stillness acknowledging him without surrendering to interruption. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence that settled between them felt different from before, not distant, not uncertain, but deliberate, as though both understood it held something worth preserving. "You allow them to question you," Adrian said at last, his voice quiet, not accusatory, but searching for something he could not yet define. Clara's gaze remained fixed beyond the glass, her reflection faint against the darkness outside. "I allow them to reveal themselves," she replied, and again, her answer was simple, yet it carried a weight that lingered far beyond the words themselves. Adrian studied her, the calm steadiness that did not shift under scrutiny, the absence of hesitation that spoke of something far older than the brief days she had spent within his home. "Most would not endure it," he continued. "Most would respond long before now." Clara's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something that suggested understanding rather than amusement. "Most have something to protect," she said softly. "Reputation, pride, expectation." She paused then, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass. "I learned early that silence protects what cannot be replaced." The words settled between them, and for the first time, Adrian sensed the outline of something deeper, something not yet spoken, but present all the same. He did not press, though every instinct urged him to ask more, to uncover the truth she held so carefully guarded. Instead, he remained where he was, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into clarity. Beyond the window, the wind moved softly across the grounds, brushing against the glass in a faint whisper. And within that quiet, Clara finally turned, her gaze meeting his fully now, without avoidance, without retreat. There was no challenge in her expression, no plea for understanding, only a quiet acceptance of what was seen and what was not. And in that moment, Adrian realized that whatever had shaped her silence was not something easily spoken, not something offered to curiosity alone. It was something carried, something endured, something that had taught her not only when to remain silent, but why. And as she inclined her head slightly, as though concluding a conversation that had never truly been spoken aloud, before moving past him into the dim corridor, Adrian remained still, the echo of her words settling into a truth he could no longer ignore, that her silence was not empty, not fragile, but deliberate, and whatever lay behind it, whatever had demanded such restraint, had not yet revealed its full weight. But he knew, with a certainty that felt both quiet and unyielding, that when it did, it would change far more than the way she was seen within his walls. Morning did not bring ease, it brought clarity, the kind that stripped away the comfort of assumption and left only what could no longer be ignored. Blackthorn Manor stirred slowly beneath a pale sky, the grounds brushed with a thin layer of frost that caught the early light, and within its walls, the rhythm of routine resumed, though not quite as it had before. Adrian Blackthorn stood near the tall windows of his study, the previous night lingering in his thoughts with a persistence that refused to fade, Clara's words echoing not as questions, but as answers he had not known to seek. Silence protects what cannot be replaced, the phrase settled heavily, suggesting not avoidance, but loss, not weakness, but preservation. He turned from the window, his decision forming without hesitation, not driven by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, something that had begun to take root since the moment he first chose to truly see her. The household staff moved with quiet efficiency, unaware of the shift that guided his steps toward the administrative wing, where records were kept not for display, but for necessity. If Clara Whitfield had come to his manor carrying more than what she revealed, then traces of it would exist somewhere beyond her silence. The steward, a careful man who prided himself on precision, looked up in mild surprise as Adrian entered unannounced, his expression tightening slightly at the unexpected presence. "Your Grace," he began, but Adrian raised a hand, not dismissive, but direct. "Miss Whitfield's employment records," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay. The request was simple, yet it carried weight, and the steward hesitated only briefly before retrieving a thin file, its contents modest, almost insufficient for someone who had already proven herself beyond expectation. Adrian took it without comment, his gaze scanning the pages with increasing focus, names of previous households, short durations, recommendations that were respectful, yet restrained, as though each employer had recognized her value without fully understanding it. But it was not the records themselves that caught his attention, it was what was missing, the gaps between entries, the absence of explanation, the quiet omission of anything that might define her beyond skill and composure. She did not remain long in any position, the steward noted carefully. Though no complaints were ever recorded, Adrian did not respond immediately, his mind tracing the pattern, not instability, not failure, but movement, deliberate and consistent, as though she had chosen departure rather than risk something greater. "And before this," he asked, his voice quieter now, "what is known?" The steward hesitated again, more noticeably this time. "Very little, Your Grace," he admitted. "Her references begin only a few years prior, nothing of her earlier circumstances is documented." The answer settled into the space between them, incomplete, unsatisfying, yet revealing in its absence. Adrian closed the file slowly, the faint sound of paper against paper marking the end of something, though not the question itself, because now he understood that Clara Whitfield had not simply arrived at his manor as she appeared, she had come from somewhere unrecorded, something unspoken, and whatever had shaped her silence had not been left behind, it had followed her, guarded as carefully as the truth she chose not to offer. He returned the file without comment, his expression unchanged, yet his thoughts far from settled, and as he stepped back into the corridor, the light shifting slightly as the morning advanced, He realized that understanding her would not come from records or recollections. It would not be given through inquiry alone. It would require patience. The same quiet endurance she carried within herself, and somewhere within that realization, a certainty began to form that whatever had taught Clara Whitfield to remain silent was not something that had ended, but something that might yet return, not as memory, but as consequence. And when it did, it would no longer remain hidden within the quiet boundaries she had so carefully maintained. The day unfolded with a deceptive calm, the kind that settled over Blackthorn Manor like a thin veil, softening the edges of everything while hiding the tension that had begun to gather beneath it. Adrian Blackthorn carried the knowledge from the records not as certainty, but as a question that deepened with every passing hour, a question that followed him through meetings, through decisions, through every quiet moment where his thoughts were left unguarded. Clara Whitfield moved through the manor as she always had, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, yet now he saw more in each small action. The precision in her movements, the careful distance she maintained, the way she never lingered where attention might settle too long. It was not avoidance, he realized, but discipline. By late afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the household was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor, his presence announced not with urgency, but with a subtle disruption that carried through the halls, altering the atmosphere without explanation. The man was introduced as Mr. Harold Whitaker, his manner composed, his appearance refined. Yet there was something in his gaze that did not belong within the calm order of the manor, something that searched rather than observed. Adrian met him in the main hall, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable, though his instincts sharpened immediately. "Your Grace," the man said with a slight inclination of his head, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I am seeking someone who I believe may be under your protection." The phrasing was careful, respectful, yet it carried a weight that settled heavily into the space between them. Adrian did not respond at once, his silence deliberate, allowing the man's words to reveal themselves fully. "Her name," Whitaker continued, "is Clara Whitfield." And in that moment, the quiet order of the day fractured, not visibly, not in a way others might notice, but within Adrian's understanding, where the question he had carried began to take form. He studied the man before him, measuring the tone, the intent, the restraint that masked something far less controlled beneath the surface. "And what business do you have with Miss Whitfield?" Adrian asked, his voice calm, though now edged with something firmer, something that did not invite assumption. Whitaker's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a pause that spoke more than any immediate answer could have done. "I represent interests that concern her past," he said at last, each word chosen with care. "Matters that require her return." The statement was simple, yet it carried an implication that did not align with the absence Adrian had found in the records, and for the first time, the silence Clara had maintained revealed itself not only as protection, but as concealment. Adrian's gaze hardened slightly, though his composure did not break. "Miss Whitfield is not an obligation to be claimed," he replied, his tone measured, controlled, yet unmistakably firm. Whitaker inclined his head again, though this time the gesture held less ease. "That may be so, Your Grace," he said. "But some matters do not end simply because one chooses silence." The words lingered, not as a threat, but as a truth that demanded acknowledgement. And as the man was escorted to await further response, Adrian remained where he stood, the quiet of the manor pressing in once more, though no longer calm, no longer distant. Because now the question he had carried was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a direction, a consequence. Clara Whitfield had not simply left something behind. She had stepped away from it, and whatever she had chosen not to speak of had now found its way to his door, not as memory, but as presence. And as Adrian turned toward the corridor where he knew she would be, he understood with absolute clarity that the silence she had guarded so carefully was about to be tested in a way that neither of them could ignore. Adrian did not search long before he found her, because Clara Whitfield had never hidden herself in the obvious sense. She had only remained where no one thought to truly look. She stood in the eastern corridor once more, near the tall windows where the fading light stretched thin across the stone floor, her posture composed, her gaze distant, as though the quiet of the manor still belonged to her despite the shift that had already begun. He slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that this moment required more than command. It required understanding, and perhaps something he had not yet fully learned to offer. "You have a visitor," he said, his voice steady, though the weight behind it could not be mistaken. Clara did not turn immediately, and in that brief pause, Adrian saw it, the smallest fracture in the stillness she had carried so effortlessly, not fear, not panic, but awareness, the kind that arrives when something long expected finally takes form. When she faced him, her expression had already returned to calm, yet the silence between them had changed, no longer neutral, no longer untouched. "I assumed it would happen eventually," she said quietly, her words neither surprised nor uncertain, simply accepted. Adrian studied her. The lack of denial, the absence of questions, and the certainty settled deeper within him. This was not coincidence. This was consequence. "He claims your past requires your return," Adrian continued, his tone measured, though now edged with something firmer, something that did not sit easily with indifference. Clara held his gaze, steady, unwavering. Yet there was something else beneath it now, something heavier, something that had not been present before. "My past does not require anything," she replied, her voice calm, though quieter than usual. "It only follows when it is allowed to." The words carried a truth that did not need explanation, and yet Adrian felt the weight of everything she did not say. "Then you will not see him," he said, the statement firm, immediate, offered not as suggestion, but as decision. For the first time since he had known her, Clara hesitated, not in weakness, but in consideration, her gaze shifting briefly, as though measuring something beyond the moment itself. "If I do not," she said at last, "it will not end here." Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "And if you do?" he asked, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Will it end at all?" The question lingered, unanswered, because both understood that some things did not end through confrontation alone. Silence followed, deeper than before, filled not with absence, but with choice. Clara lowered her gaze briefly, not in retreat, but in thought, her hands still, her breath steady, and when she looked up again, the quiet certainty had returned, though now it carried something more, something resolute. "I will speak to him," she said, and the words settled between them with quiet finality. Adrian did not agree immediately, though every instinct urged him to refuse, to deny the man access, to keep whatever threatened her beyond the walls he controlled. But he had learned enough to understand that this was not a matter he could command without consequence. Clara had chosen silence for a reason, and now she was choosing to break it, not for herself alone, but because something had reached the point where it could no longer remain unspoken. "You will not face him alone," Adrian said at last, his voice firm, leaving no space for refusal. Clara held his gaze, and for a moment, something passed between them, not gratitude, not dependence, but acknowledgement, the kind that recognized presence without surrendering independence. "Very well," she replied softly, and as the light faded further beyond the windows, leaving the corridor dim and shadowed, Adrian understood that whatever had shaped her silence was no longer hidden. It had arrived, and the strength he had only begun to see would now be tested not in quiet moments, but in truth, spoken aloud at last. The meeting was arranged without spectacle, without the grand formality that usually accompanied matters of importance within Blackthorn Manor, and yet the air carried a weight that no ceremony could have amplified. The drawing room stood quiet, its tall windows dimmed by the fading light, the last traces of evening settling into shadow as a single fire cast a low, steady glow across the room. Adrian Blackthorn stood near the hearth, his presence composed, though his attention remained fixed on the doorway long before it opened. When Clara Whitfield entered, her steps were measured as always, her posture calm, but there was no mistaking the shift beneath her stillness. Not fear, not hesitation, but resolve. She did not look to Adrian immediately, as though this moment belonged not to him, but to something she had carried far longer. Moments later, the door opened again, and Harold Whitaker stepped inside, his expression controlled, his gaze settling on Clara with an intensity that confirmed what words had only suggested. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and the silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was not empty, not passive, but filled with everything that had been left unspoken for years. "Miss Whitfield," Whitaker began, his tone measured, though the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "You have made this more difficult than necessary." Clara did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, yet carried a clarity that held its ground without effort. "I left because it was necessary," she said, and the simplicity of her words left no space for negotiation. Whitaker's expression tightened slightly. "You misunderstand the nature of your situation," he replied. "What you left behind was not yours to abandon." Adrian's gaze sharpened at that, though he did not interrupt. Not yet, because this was Clara's moment, not his. She met Whitaker's gaze without wavering. "What I left behind was never mine to keep," she answered, and for the first time, something in her voice shifted, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, as though the truth had reached a point where silence could no longer contain it. Whitaker stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a quiet insistence that sought to reclaim control of the narrative. "You were given responsibility," he said, "and your departure has consequences that cannot be ignored." Clara's expression did not change, but her next words carried a weight that settled heavily into the room. "Responsibility requires consent," she said, not silence. The statement was simple, yet it cut through the carefully constructed restraint that had framed the conversation. Adrian felt the shift then, not just in the room, but in Clara herself, the quiet strength he had witnessed now stepping forward without losing its composure. Whitaker hesitated, and in that hesitation, the balance changed, the certainty he had carried into the manor no longer unchallenged. "You believe you can refuse," he said at last, though the conviction in his voice had begun to thin. "You believe you can simply walk away." Clara took a single step forward, her movement calm, deliberate, her gaze unwavering. "I already have," she replied, and the words settled with a finality that left no space for argument. Silence followed, deeper than before, heavier, because now it held truth that could not be dismissed. Adrian stepped forward then, not to speak over her, but to stand beside her, his presence no longer distant, no longer observational, but aligned, deliberate. "Miss Whitfield has made her position clear," he said, his tone measured, yet firm. "And in this house, her decision stands." Whitaker's gaze shifted between them, the control he had carried now, fractured by something he had not anticipated, not resistance, but clarity. After a moment, he inclined his head, though the gesture carried none of its earlier confidence. "Then this matter is not concluded," he said quietly, and without further argument. He turned, his departure as controlled as his arrival, though the certainty had left him. When the door closed behind him, the room fell into silence once more. But this time, it was not the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of something resolved, something spoken that could no longer be undone. Clara remained still for a moment, her breath steady, her composure unbroken, and though she did not look at Adrian immediately, he understood that what had just passed was not simply confrontation, it was release, the breaking of a silence that had been carried for far too long, and in its place, something stronger had emerged, something that no longer needed to hide. The door closed with a quiet finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as though the walls of Blackthorn Manor themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just transpired. For a moment, neither Adrian nor Clara moved, the firelight casting soft shadows across the room, the air still carrying the remnants of tension, now slowly dissolving into something calmer, something steadier. Clara's hands remained at her sides, her posture unchanged, yet there was a subtle shift in her. Breathing, not unsteady, not strained, but lighter, as though something long held had finally been released. Adrian did not speak immediately, because he understood that this silence was not one to be filled, it was one to be honored. When Clara finally turned toward him, her gaze met his fully, without the careful distance she had maintained before, and though her expression remained composed, there was something new within it, not vulnerability, but openness, quiet and unguarded. "It will not end here," she said softly, her voice carrying neither fear nor regret. only certainty. Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in her words. No, he replied, his tone steady. But it will not begin again as it once did. The assurance was simple, yet it held a weight that did not rely on force, only on resolve. Clara studied him for a moment, as though measuring the meaning beneath his words, and then, slowly, she nodded, not in agreement alone, but in understanding. The silence that followed was different now, no longer protective, no longer concealing, but shared, something that existed between them without tension or uncertainty. Outside, the wind moved softly across the grounds, brushing against the windows in a low, steady rhythm. And within the quiet of the room, Clara took a single step closer, not out of need, but out of choice. I did not speak because it was safer not to, she said, her voice low, her gaze steady. But silence does not mean absence. Adrian's expression did not change, yet something in his posture softened, something that had once been distant now settling into something more present, more deliberate. I know, he replied, and the simplicity of his answer carried a truth that required no further explanation. Clara's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, and then, for the first time since she had entered his world, the faintest hint of something warmer touched her expression, not a smile, but something close enough to be recognized as ease. She turned then, moving toward the door with the same quiet grace that had defined her presence from the beginning, yet now it felt different. No longer the movement of someone avoiding notice, but of someone who no longer needed to. Adrian remained where he stood, watching as she left the room, the soft sound of the door closing behind her marking not an ending, but a continuation, because now he understood what others had failed to see, that her silence had never been a lack, never been a weakness, but a choice shaped by experience, refined by restraint, and strengthened by everything she had endured without speaking. And as the firelight flickered against the stone walls, Adrian Blackthorne found himself no longer questioning what Clara Whitfield had chosen not to say, but respecting the truth she had revealed when she finally did. Some voices were not meant to fill a room. They were meant to change it, quietly, completely, and once heard, they could never be mistaken again.